me, even in India, nothing like that has ever happened. And I think for a lot of people, this is really traumatic. But I also feel that this is a great opportunity. This is a great opportunity from the point of view of the Dharma for so many reasons. And I'm sure you know that it makes sense, but to really feel it, to really get a sense, oh yeah, this is a great opportunity. Well, that's the difficult part. Okay, I go through a little bit. All right. That's the hardest part. But I want to talk about a few things that come to mind every day when I listen to the news, when I think about this situation. I guess you are in lockdown, like you can't go out. In Germany, we can't go out. So I spend a lot of time inside, of course. I'm with my mom. I go shopping. That's all I do. And I see other people. The situation, it's really tense. But like I said, it's such a great opportunity for so many reasons. So one thing that comes up is what His Holiness always says, what the Dalai Lama always says. He always talks about hygiene. Now, it's so interesting because hygiene is so important at this point, like washing your hands, like physical hygiene. I've never washed my hands that many times, and I think I've never washed my hands properly. I've never washed my hands for 20 seconds, and not the way I do it now. But the Dalai Lama always says, not just physical hygiene, also mental hygiene, so important. So that definitely came to mind when I start thinking about hygiene. We need to keep clean. What about mental hygiene? Then social distancing. Yeah, so important to socially distance ourselves from other people. Well, what about distancing from negative emotions, from selfish reactions? So that kind of distancing. Just as important, but usually not really mentioned in, well, social media, them, or not social, like on TV, etc. Then I'll talk about it a little bit, but mainly it's about social distancing. It's about physical hygiene. And so this is where I think the Dharma comes in, definitely big time. Also, our life has slowed down. I mean, we have a lot of time, I guess. Many of you, I don't know whether you do home office or you're laid, like, what is it called, laid off. You can't work at all. You got more time. So this is a great opportunity, again, to practice the Dharma. But also many Buddhist ideas are part of the situation right now. First of all, if I just go through what's called the Lamrim, precious human rebirth, we have this precious body. And oftentimes in situations like this, what we remember is what we don't have, what we lose. But then again, to also remember what we have, it could be so much worse. It could be so much worse. I mean, I'm pretty sure in Israel, it's not as bad as in India, for example, or in some African countries where they don't have the same kind of hygiene, they don't have the same opportunities. So I remember someone on the radio the other day just said, it could be so much worse. And I thought, wow, so true what this person said. It could be so much worse. And so to reflect upon the things we have. And also we live at a time where we have so much. We just got, not just do we have so much, we have an access of everything. Too much, we have too much. Now we're going to lose a lot of that access, I'm pretty sure. But again, we make some time for other things that may be more important, that may be much more helpful, much more, make much more sense. So again, a new opportunity. And then after having thought about our precious human birth, I mean, our opportunity, what we have, the good things in our life, that despite this problem are still there. Maybe we'll have an opportunity to see it clear. But then also, of course, death and impermanence. Well, impermanence. So in Buddhism, we talk about two types of impermanence. Impermanence that is coarse, and impermanence that's very subtle. Coarse impermanence, well, yes, death. It's happening all around us. Or not just death, but things stop being the same way as they used to be. So again, well, this is difficult, things changing, change is always hard, But to get familiar, to become familiar, okay, this is just part of life, especially since our existence is an existence that comes along with problems. It's in the nature of things that we have problems, that we have difficulties, that things never remain the same. So again, something to reflect upon. Nothing will be the same from day to day. Things are different, and this brings about great changes. Other things, well, dependent arising. It's amazing how much I think about dependent arising. First of all, dependent arising from the point of view of relativity. For some people, this is a disaster. For other people, it's a blessing in disguise. I mean, it is for those people who make toilet paper. I mean, they make so much money. Those people who make groceries, they make so much money. So there are a lot of people who benefit from this. To my own embarrassment, to a certain degree, I'm having the time of my life. For the first time, I don't have to go out. I don't have to have contact with other people. I can do what I like to do. I don't have to go see my relatives all the time. I can just stay in my room, and I love that part. But of course, that's not to say that it's not terrible for other people and what's happening, and it's awful to hear what's happening to other people. Again, another opportunity, of course, to practice compassion, but also relativity. Like for one person, it's terrible. For another person, it isn't that bad. That's from the point of view of dependent arising, but also the interconnectedness of everything. And that is definitely one of the most amazing parts, that a tiny virus made it all the way around the world, just showing how we're interconnected, but also how this virus stopping production in China affects us now in the West, not having certain produce, not having face masks, etc. So again, another way to reflect upon the situation, taking to mind dependent arising. But most important, compassion. What an opportunity to practice compassion. What an opportunity. Because people are so scared. I mean, everyone around us is scared. I guess the people I see in the stores, sometimes they're quite aggressive. Sometimes they're very kind. A lot of very kind people, but also a lot of very aggressive people. And first reaction is, oh gosh, what a jerk. I mean, they're so selfish. But then again, it's fear. It's just good old fear. Just being scared of not being able to feed their family, not being able to working their job, maybe losing their job, losing their income, losing what they're familiar with. There's so much fear right now. And I think that is one of the worst things, that there's so much fear. And of course, everyone is different. Some people have more fear than others, but I think a lot of fear. People experience a lot of fear, which is why I love teaching the Heart Sutra, because that is one sutra that is said to be a great antidote to fear. Great antidote to fear, to worry, to what else? Being scared, feeling nervous, feeling depressed about the situation, etc. So I think that's a great opportunity to, read the Heart Sutra together. Now, since I can see you, I keep going through everyone here. I can see you, but I can't hear you. This is very irritating. So I don't know. Never mind. No, never mind. Sure, it's what it is. So I don't know whether you can hear me clearly. I haven't offered any prayers. We haven't done any prayers because I don't know how religious in the sense like how much you are into Buddhism, whether you would like to do prayers or not. So for now, I'll just continue talking, and then I could have maybe your reflection for the future, whether you want prayers, whether you want to do some meditation together. We can arrange that later on, because this won't be the last class, or it won't be the last kind of meeting. I should call it a meeting. Anyway, so I'll just continue with this, talking about this particular sutra, which is so important in terms of fearlessness. How does that have to do with fearlessness? Well, because it teaches what's called wisdom. understanding. It talks about how to understand things. And that, of course, if we think about it, a lot of the fear that we may experience in this situation, and I don't know whether you experience fear, I can't say, but if it's not because of this situation, we definitely have fearful times and fearful situations. And so, therefore, this sutra, an understanding of how things actually exist, which the sutra claims to teach, is said to be one of the most effective antidotes to fear. Because what we're afraid of, we don't know what's going to happen, we don't know what to expect. So a lot of the fear comes from not understanding, from not knowing. But it's not just understanding. The sutra doesn't just talk about understanding. Wisdom, so understanding doesn't just mean an intellectual understanding. Of course, first, deep insight needs to be preceded by a correct intellectual understanding. But then that correct intellectual understanding is deepened. It's deepened to such a degree that it becomes an experiential understanding, to a degree that our actions are totally influenced by that understanding. An experience such that our emotions are affected by that understanding. Now, that is a process that takes a lot of time. A lot of steps are needed in between to get there. But one of the first steps is to read to learn about one of those sutras, which is the Heart Sutra. And the Heart Sutra, not only is it wisdom, but it's wisdom that is conjoined by compassion. Compassion, a loving attitude that wishes for another person, including oneself and other people, to be free from suffering. That's the definition of compassion. Now, it's easy to just say those words. In actuality, it's a feeling where one feels very deeply, from deep within, a sense of closeness towards others and the wish that they may be free from suffering. And that compassion is so strong that it actually influences our actions, such that we do not just go about removing our own suffering, but also try to get our actions direct our actions towards the removal of problems and difficulties of other people. So those two, wisdom and compassion, those go together. And this is what the sutra teaches. This is what this very brief, actually quite like a brief, it's just a brief teaching, a very unusual teaching. The way this sutra teaches compassion, teaches wisdom, mainly wisdom, implicitly also compassion, the way it does so, we wouldn't teach nowadays. It's quite unusual. Well, it goes back 2,600 years ago. And it was first, this sutra was taught, and then only later on it was written down. And the style is kind of unusual, a little hard to understand, and that's why it needs to be explained. And the perfection of the sutra, the Heart Sutra, is part of a whole genre of sutras, which are described as Prajnaparamita Sutras. Perfection of wisdom is another way of saying it, but I prefer the Sanskrit because I don't like the word perfection. So Prajnaparamita Sutras, the sutras that deal with the wisdom that has gone beyond ordinary wisdom. So perfection, like I said, I don't like that word. I prefer to say wisdom that's gone beyond, an extraordinary wisdom. It's gone to the other side, to the extraordinary, if you like. So there's a whole genre of teachings that were given by the Buddha that are called Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. Now, usually in this context, what is talked about, like when describing the sutra and talking about this sutra, usually we start off with the teachers or our teachers, they used to start off first talking about, well, the Buddha first taught something else. He first turned the first wheel of Dharma, as it's called. So he first taught the Four Noble Truths. Then he gave the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, and then, which is called the second wheel. The Four Noble Truths is described as the first wheel of the Dharma, the first body of the teachings when the Buddha started teaching. Then there is the second wheel of the Dharma called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And then there's the third wheel of the Dharma, which describes, well, there's two aspects. And I'll get to this in a moment. So basically, you have three wheels of Dharma. The Buddha taught in three stages. Four Noble Truth, you're all familiar, well, I guess you're familiar with to a certain degree. It mainly deals with suffering, our problems, our difficulties, identifying them, and identifying the causes and removing those by means of applying the right methods. Which takes me to what Buddhism actually means. Many people say Buddhism is a religion, which I guess it is, but after the study that I've done, I feel much more that Buddhism is a system of psychology. It's a system of psychology which has religious aspects because they're psychologically helpful. So what we call in Buddhism, what is the religious aspect? For instance, the Dalai Lama sometimes likes to divide Buddhism in three parts, not like the way I described the Buddha's teachings into three wheels. No, just taking all the Buddhist teachings. The Dalai Lama says there is the philosophy, there's psychology, and there is religion. Now, to me, I totally agree with that division, with this way of categorizing, but I think the main category is psychology, and even the religious part and the philosophical part is part of the psychology. And the religious part, what is the religious part? Well, what we can observe, like devotional practices, having faith, having devotion, all these aspects that you see people in temples, etc. But that's still psychology. Why do people engage in devotional aspects? Because it's good for the mind. Having faith in something, having devotion, being inspired by something greater, to inspire towards it, to work towards it. Well, that's just good for the mind. It's good for the mind because it gives us meaning. It gives us sense. It gives us meaning in our life. Plus, it allows us to work towards something greater, working to something greater, which we all have the ability to. We have the ability to work towards something greater in the sense to make more use of the incredible power of our own mind. Incredible power that we have, but that right now we haven't even tapped into. We don't know yet the kind of the power, our mind's power. We haven't really tapped into it. We can do so much more. So therefore, with regard to Buddhism, Buddhism is a psychology, a system of psychology that offers religious aspects, but it also offers philosophical aspects in that it explains how phenomena exist, what reality is, how things really exist, etc. In order for us to benefit from it, to generate wisdom, to generate certain states of mind, and again, psychology, certain psychological states, to remove problems and find more satisfaction, more happiness. Therefore, talking about Buddhism being a system of psychology, now how did the Buddha set this forth? How did the Buddha go about setting forth the system of psychology? Well, he first turned the first wheel of Dharma, talked about the shortcomings in our life, understanding that there's a root cause, understanding what's the cause of them. Usually we look for external means to remove those root causes, but instead not looking for external means, but looking inside, finding the root cause, and then removing suffering. So the emphasis is a lot on cessation, removing suffering, just removing our difficulties. The second wheel, which is described as the second wheel or the wheel of the Prajnaparamita Sutras, in those sutras, the Buddha talks about how do we go about this? How do we reach this cessation? How do we reach this state that is free from suffering? In particular, what do we need to know? What do we need to understand? And in answer to that, the main topic, therefore, of the Prajnaparamita Sutras is what's called the ultimate nature of phenomena, how phenomena really exist. Sometimes the word selflessness is used, sometimes emptiness. Different words can be used. Emptiness just has a negative connotation, but basically that's the technical word. In the West, it has a negative connotation, but it's actually just has nothing to do with the word, oh, my life is so empty, kind of emptiness. No, but emptiness in the sense of a certain mode of being of phenomena, selflessness, or a certain mode of it, ultimate nature of phenomena. So that is what we need to understand in order to actualize what the Buddha taught during the first turning of the wheel. The stopping, the cessation of all our problems, all our difficulties, which all come from our own mind. That is the second. So the second wheel, therefore, teaches mainly the ultimate nature of phenomena. The third wheel then has two aspects. The third wheel talks about the mind, first of all. What is that mind that needs to understand the object? What is the nature of that mind that understands how phenomena really exist? And so in connection to that, what kind of minds are there? What types of mind are there? Coarser ones, subtler ones, etc. So that's one aspect of the third wheel. But another aspect is also clarifying some contradictions between the first and the second wheel that some people seem to see in what the Buddha had said. So the first wheel and the second wheel seem contradictory to some students, and that was clarified during the third wheel. So this is basically, in a nutshell, what the Buddha has taught. What is the Buddha taught? The Buddha talks about our problems, our difficulties, that they're unnecessary, they shouldn't be there. It's actually not in the nature of our mind. We're not supposed to have these problems and these difficulties, which is why we constantly work towards removing them. And the Buddha basically is saying, well, we can remove them. We cannot change the world around us, but we can change our reaction towards it. We can change our own mind and find real satisfaction, lasting satisfaction. But only if we know what to focus on, and that is dealt with during the second wheel, the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. So how phenomena really exist, if we understand that, then we can reach that cessation. But we need to also understand the mind. What is the mind? How does the mind work that gains that understanding, the understanding of emptiness, which is described during the third wheel. And so, having given you that short overview, well, then with regard to coming back to the Prajnaparamita Sutras, those are, the second wheel is said to be the most important teaching. Not that the other teachings are not important. Yeah, they're all important, but the most important ones are the ones that are given during the second turning of the wheel, the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So the Prajnaparamita Sutras, one of them is, of course, the Heart Sutra. One of them, oh, I lost all my pictures. Some people are not. Some people I just see their names. Okay, never mind. It just keeps going back and forth. So I have a sense of like an audience, some people there. All right, anyway, now with regard to the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, one of them being the Heart Sutra, those are the most important body of teachings. Most important in the sense that every study, everything you do in Buddhism, whatever you study, whatever you learn, directly or indirectly, it refers to those Prajnaparamita Sutras. Directly or indirectly, it refers to those. So there's one great Tibetan master from the past called Jamyang Shepa. His expertise were the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And so someone once criticized him, said, well, you don't really know much about Buddhism. There's so much to Buddhism, and all you focus on is the Prajnaparamita Sutras. So does that mean you neglect everything else? And he said, no, everything in Buddhism, directly or indirectly, connects to those particular sutras. So he talked about logic, for instance. There's the study of logic. You may have heard of the study of debate, of questioning, of reasoning, of debating with one another. With regard to that tradition, well, that relates to the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras, because the debate, the questioning is there in order to understand them better. Then there's the study of the middle way, of Madhyamika, of the middle way, Well, that is the emptiness. That is the middle way as it's set forth in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. That's the ultimate nature of phenomena as it is set forth in the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And then you have the topic of the Vinaya, the code of conduct, the kind of ethical discipline a practitioner of the Dharma, of Buddhism, should apply. Well, that's the discipline someone should apply in order to practice the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras. And then lastly, you have Abhidharma, you have phenomenology, all these different divisions, etc. Well, those are the divisions you find in the Prajnaparamita Sutras. And that is basically the study of Buddhism as it's traditionally done. You have these main topics, and these topics that I just mentioned are basically the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras themselves. And then those other topics, logic, discipline, phenomenology, and Madhyamika. Those are the topics that are usually studied, and they all revolve around these sutras. And from that's how it's usually explained, saying they are so important. So if you want to learn Buddhism, learn about those sutras. But of course, some of those sutras are incredibly long. The longest is said to have 100,000 verses. And it is taught in a way which would, for us, be too repetitive. It's not exciting enough. In the 21st century, we need a certain way to be taught, and the Perfection of Wisdom Sutras in 100,000 verses are definitely not our favorite, because it seems very repetitive to us. It's actually meant for meditation, and so therefore just reading through it would not be enough. Then there are shorter versions, 25,000 verses, 8,000 verses, so different versions. There's a condensed version that has 8 volumes altogether. It's a lot less than the 8,000 verses, 25,000, 100,000 verses. But luckily, there's an even shorter version, which is the Heart Sutra, which is actually not called Heart Sutra at all. It's actually the translation. It is a very loose translation of the text. It actually is called the essence of Prajnaparamita, the essence of wisdom, basically. Okay. Now, with regard to this particular teaching, it is done in the way which reflects the Buddhist approach to study. Question and answer, basically. Someone asks a question and there's an answer. It's done not in a discussion type. In the longer sutras, you find a lot more of these discussions going back and forth, this dialogue. Here, it's basically a question is asked, someone answered, and the Buddha says, well, great, well done. So as you've probably seen the sutra, read the sutra, the material was sent to you. I've sent like a bunch of texts to you, which are usually used in the FPMT, organization, when this text is taught. So I will send this because I'm supposed to do this in Tushita in June, which I don't know whether it's going to happen. But anyway, so I passed it on to you. Most important for you is, of course, the root text, but you may even find the other parts interesting. And like I said, we'll go through the text together. Now I have one question. Do we have question and answer? Does that work? Sure, does that work? To have question and answer?
Yes, we can do that, no problem.
Okay.
People can, maybe I'll just instruct the people, they can raise their hands, some in the bottom,
You
and
have
then
everyone in front of you? Do you have everyone there you can see? All right. I'd like to keep the questions more towards the end, but if there's something not clear, if there's a way people could say something or maybe write a little comment, and otherwise I'll keep it towards the end if you have any questions, if you have any comments, any questions, mainly questions. Okay, great. All right, so with the material, like I said, there'll be a few of these sessions we have together. So you'll have the opportunity to read the material. You probably didn't have much time to do so today, but you'll have more time in the future, become more familiar with the sutra. And I don't know whether I really want to go into the sutra today, because I still want to give more of a context, to provide more of a context, since, as I said earlier on, this sutra is kind of unusual. It is difficult to read, difficult to understand, and to say a few other things before that. Okay. Now, previously I also spoke about the sutra being so important in terms of removing fearlessness. So the Heart Sutra, or the essence of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, as it's actually called, is basically just a summary of all the sutras I've mentioned earlier. So it contains the explicit and implicit meaning of the other sutras. And I've talked about fearlessness, which is quite interesting because just today I listened to a program. Someone sent me something talking about the importance of removing fear, especially in a situation like this. Why? It was like this whole idea, and it's again psychology. It's just basic psychology. And like I said, to me, Buddhism is just a system of ancient psychology. It's quite different. The terminology is a little different. The way things are set forth is different. But it comes down to a science of the mind, a system of psychology, of dealing with the mind, understanding the mind, in order to then deal with our problems, remove our problems, and tap into our actual nature, the actual nature of the mind. Now, what someone said today, talking about fear, saying that especially at this point in time, fear is so it's so dangerous because it's really bad for the immune system. That if we have fear, if we are fearful, giving us the advice, don't listen to everything that's on the radio, on like don't look at all these images, it's just going to overwhelm you. Like, get the information you need, but don't watch all these special programs, etc. Why? Because, well, fear does something to your immune system, and therefore it weakens you. And it may also lead you to believe that every sneeze and every cough, that actually leads you to believe that you have the disease, makes you feel even worse. And of course, it'll be a problem if you ask for a test right away. It's a problem for the health system. But they also spoke about this what is it called? This phenomenon of nocebo. Instead of placebo, nocebo, where if you think you have the virus, for instance, or you've taken some substance that is poisonous, you may actually have the actual symptoms of that. So they talked about a guy. He actually took some candies that tasted, we have them in Germany. They have like a pepperminty kind of taste, and he took them, but on the packaging it said siankali, some kind of poison, siankali. So he thought he'd ingested this. He was kind of suicidal, and he believed he had just taken a pill of siankali, this poison. And he was rushed to a hospital because he started developing the symptoms of siankali poisoning. And that was a huge phenomenon because he hadn't taken anything. So this is not called the placebo effect, where you take a Smartie, or you take some candy and you believe it to be medicine. It actually helps you. It's the opposite, where you believe you've taken something harmful, and then the symptoms of that, they actually manifest. And there are many examples. Some other examples were given, but I thought that was the most potent one. And again, to me, it shows just the power of our own mind, where fear, where worry, etc., can actually harm us to such a degree that we may believe we have the disease and actually show the symptoms, but of course also harm our immune system, etc. So again, it takes us back to fear, which can be counteracted by this particular sutra, by an understanding of how phenomena, through getting an understanding of how phenomena really exist. And so one important aspect of that is understanding dependent arising, the interdependence of phenomena. So those two, the actual nature of phenomena and dependent arising, they go hand in hand. They cannot be explained separately. And so in the sutra, basically the Buddha, through other people, it's said to be a teaching by the Buddha, inspired by the Buddha, which is given by other people on the ultimate nature of phenomena, of how phenomena really exist. Of course, in combination with dependent arising. So if you want to know what is the most important part of this sutra, it's actually 4 sentences, just 4 sentences. And the rest is basically just saying, well, what is true in the case of those 4 sentences is true for everything else. So here it talks about the fact that all phenomena are what are called empty. Of course, empty. What does empty mean? Empty, again, I said this earlier on, I don't know in Hebrew, but in English or in German, it's not a positive word. Someone says my life is empty, the situation is empty. It just sounds very negative. But here it's just a negation. It's just saying phenomena do not exist in a certain way. They're empty of a certain mode of existence. And that is a really interesting idea that I don't think exists in the same way in the West. Maybe there's some aspects where it seems some philosophers, even some scientists may actually talk about emptiness, but it's not clearly spelled out. But it's this idea that things appear to us very solidly, very clearly defined. And it's actually challenging that, saying phenomena do not exist in such a clear and solid and clearly defined way. That is especially important at times like now, because it seems there's this threat from the outside, this enemy, this entity. It seems very real and very solid. But when we look closer, when we really look for this threat, this solidity, the more we look for it, the more it disappears. It's really interesting. It's like our reality is like looking at a laptop screen, which you're all doing right now, looking at a laptop screen, right? Or whatever you're looking at, a tablet screen. If you were to go literally physically closer and closer and closer and closer, that image that seemed so solid previously, the closer you get, the more it disappears. Because in the end, what you see is pixels. Well, don't even know you can see those single pixels because they're so tiny. But if you were actually literally, it was actually possible to get closer and closer and closer to the screen, in the end, everything that seems so solid would disappear. So that is one way of talking about what the Buddha has actually talked about when he described wisdom. Wisdom as in like an understanding that things seem so solid from afar, so clearly defined. There's a thought in our mind, and we believe that this thought of this object, that's how this object exists, because we perceive it that way, because we perceive it, and so therefore it must exist in that way. We perceive it that way because it exists that way. But what the Buddha is actually saying, he's saying, no, it exists because we perceive it. It's not that we perceive it because it exists that way, but it exists that way because we perceive it that way. That in actuality, what we call reality is basically a projection of our own mind. It's what our own mind perceives, what our own mind creates. It's a bit of a tricky word, but basically, when we say reality, there's my reality, there's your reality, and reality is just the summary of everyone's reality. And what you perceive is very different to what I perceive in the situation right now. I mean, I definitely took my picture out of here. I couldn't see myself. I got myself out of it, so I wouldn't look at myself. So right now, I definitely see something that you don't see, and I see, and you see something that I don't see, right? So therefore, with regard to everyone's reality, everyone's got their own reality, and reality is basically the perception of our own mind. I think we can all agree with this to a certain degree, but this is only scratching the surface, just saying, well, we perceive something that's out there and that exists exactly the way we perceive it, and the only reason we perceive it is because it exists that way. But if we think about it, even without getting into the most difficult ideas of emptiness, if we think about it, well, everyone perceives something slightly different. None of us perceive the same. Just because we have different eyes, we're in a different place, we have a different background, we are different people. And we can never sit in the same spot at the same time. So whatever your eyes perceive right now, or eyes helping you to perceive with your eye consciousness, well, you will always have a slightly different perspective than everyone else in the room. And of course, your colors, your shapes, all that is very likely to be quite different. Of course, your cultural background, your experiences, etc. Now, this is a very coarse idea. But if we think about it, it makes total sense. And then if we take modern physics into this equation, if we take modern physics into it, well, we know that, for instance, colors, the way we perceive them, they don't exist. They're light waves. They're light waves with different length. And we just perceive these light waves as different colors, as blue, as yellow, etc. But those colors don't exist out there in the same way as they appear to us. And a lot of the smells around us, we don't perceive them. A lot of the sounds, we don't perceive them. And again, what we perceive is only the result of the coming together of our unique brain, our unique sense faculties, and of course, our unique mind, which also is part of interpreting what's happening around us. So basically what we see is interpretation of our own mind, which is why this is what the Buddha explains during the second turning of the wheel. Things don't exist the way they appear, which is why we have to understand the mind. If our mind creates our reality during the last turning of the wheel, so important, what is the mind? Okay. But going back to the second turning. So phenomena do not exactly exist the way they appear to us. It's not saying, when I use the word exactly, I use this on purpose, because no one is saying that nothing exists. No one is saying, I don't exist, you don't exist, the laptop doesn't exist, the computer, Israel, Germany, etc., the whole world, Corona. Yeah, they all exist, but not in the way we believe them to exist. Because as I already said earlier, we believe them to be, we believe that we see things, we hear things, we think about things, just because they already are that way. And because they already exist exactly the way we perceive them, that's why we perceive them. But like I said, it's the other way around. They are there because our mind perceives them. It's not that they're there and therefore we perceive them. You see that switch? Does that make sense? Does that make sense, that switch around? That we don't see things because they exist that way, because that's not how that we don't, no, sorry, I'm getting confused myself. We don't see things because they already are like that. No, they are like that because we perceive them that way. Which is why we all perceive them differently, in the sense that one would say this is beautiful and the other one would say it's ugly. And we don't separate them. We don't say, oh, there's the beauty of the table and there's the table, right? So we perceive an object like a table, for instance, to just give a very simple example. But this is, of course, true for other people, for situations, etc. But to keep it simple, an object such as a table, we perceive a table, but together with the perception of the table, we would say it's beautiful or it's ugly. And we can already compare with other people. We can already compare the situation. And then one person would say, oh, this is beautiful. And the other one would say it's ugly. Well, yeah, because for everyone, the perception is slightly different. What they perceive is different. There's a different mind at work. And so the same is true for a difficult situation. For one person, this is a problem. This is depressing. For the next person, it's a challenge. Is possibly a blessing in disguise. It's something positive. So if you think about this, I mean, if I first talk about it, just saying that it may make sense to you, it may not. If it does make sense to a certain degree, well, it has to make sense to such a degree that the logical conclusion is that a problem is a problem as long as we hold on to it. A problem is a problem as long as we hold on to it. And if you take it a little deeper, there's like a whole process of thought. It takes you to a level where you understand there's an incredible freedom that comes with the mind. There's an incredible freedom, because if it's really true that our mind is responsible for what we perceive, is responsible for how we perceive things, well, then the one thing we can control, we can learn to control, is our own mind. If we can learn to control our own mind, we can learn to control the way we look at things, right? So again, psychology. This is where Buddhist psychology comes in. But this is only possible to actually do this if we understand that we can do this with the things we perceive, because they don't exist as solidly as they seem. If things were really solidly, this is this and it's nothing else, we couldn't do this. We couldn't do this because it'd be silly. But, and this is what we're going to go through with this sutra, if things don't exist as solidly, if we can establish, if we can prove basically by going through the reasoning that, yes, first when we look at it from afar, it seems very solid. Things seem very solid. This is my life. This is me. This is you. This is my problem. This is good. This is bad. If all this, if we really look at this, if we look closer, if we see that actually just as the screen, where we get closer and closer and closer, we cannot find these solid objects that without looking closer, they seem so solid. Well, we can do the same with the objects around us, with the objects. This is great. Okay, let's look for the greatness within the great. What does it make? Is it in and of itself great? Or is it my interpretation of that? Is it my interpretation of the situation? Because someone else looks at it and thinks it's terrible, and I say it's great. So what is it? Right? So only when we understand that, or only, well, it depends on the person, but basically it's extremely helpful to understand that things seem very solid in the sense independently. It's like this, it's not like that. But if we look a little closer, we dig a little deeper, it becomes a lot more hazy, right? A lot more hazy. So the objects, when we look for some essence, some essential good or bad, problem, difficulty, etc., then the more we look, the less clearly, the less clear things appear, and it becomes more obvious that it comes from our own mind. Okay, so now this was taking it really far, depending on how much you learned about Buddhism, but this is basically going right into the idea of how phenomena really exist. And of course, this is what the whole sutra is all about. But not to forget, a better understanding of how things really exist is, as I said earlier on, conjoined with love and compassion. So this is a bit of a danger when talking about the wisdom aspect, like talking about how things really exist and how the mind exists. It becomes quite dry. It becomes quite dry. So in this context, in particular, within the context of an understanding of how things really exist in the Buddhist context, again and again, so important to take into consideration compassion, love, consideration for others. So even though it's not, things don't exist as clearly as they seem, but they still exist. No one is saying that others don't exist, I don't exist. And here again, what understanding and wisdom allows us to do, it allows us to break the distance between ourselves and others. Because that's, again, it seems very solidly defined. That is me and that's you. Okay? But that divide is, again, just mental. Mental in the sense that there's a sense I'm over here and you're over there, that there's no connection, but of course, interdependence. everything I have now, everything I enjoy now is because of others. I don't have toilet paper. Well, not much left. Not much toilet paper because of others. Or I have toilet paper, some rolls there, because of others. Right? I have food because of others. I have this, that. So everything I have right now is because of others. So the interrelatedness, basically everything, all the good things in my life are really from others. One of my teachers, wonderful practitioner, wonderful meditators, he does these meditations. They're incredible. I mean, he goes into some details. Some of you have heard his name, Geshe Kelsang. He does this meditation where he meditates upon the kindness of other people in the sense of providing us with streets, with a street. A street, we take it for granted. We say we pay taxes. So of course we have streets. We should have streets because we pay for it. Well, but just the money, just throwing it out of the window is not going to produce any streets. So he talks about just thinking of the kindness of others, those people who are involved in the process of making streets, something we take totally for granted, or picking up the garbage, right? Just the things outside of our house. So these are little kind of meditations that we can do in terms of our food, in terms of everything we know. Everything we know is because others taught us. If we'd been born on some freaky island with like nothing around us, I mean, we wouldn't know the things we know now. So everything we know, everything we can is because of others. So although we say, yes, me and others, but that divide, it's a conventional, yes, of course, we're not identical, we're not the same, but we're very much connected, we're very strongly connected. And if everything I have is because of others, well then my happiness is also dependent on the happiness of others. If everyone was miserable around me, I'd be pretty miserable. So again, my happiness is dependent on others' happiness. And if the divide between us, that according to the ultimate nature of phenomena, that the second sutra, the second turning of the wheel, in particular Heart Sutra here in this case, talks about, if phenomena don't exist as solidly as you and I, if it's not as that dividing line is not as solid, then my happiness being more important and your happiness being less important, well, that is no longer true. Which is why it makes sense to have compassion. The wish for others to be happy makes just as much sense as the wish for myself to be happy. It makes sense to me. Of course, we have a responsibility in the sense, well, we have a wish to be happy. We have a natural wish to be happy. And I believe that we also have a right to be happy, of course, and even the responsibility. I mean, it's in our nature. It's in the nature of our mind. It wishes to be happy, and we should work towards our own happiness without sacrificing the happiness of others, definitely. But just as important as our own well-being, our own satisfaction, is that of others. Why? Because the way we believe the dividing line to be between I and others, my group, my religion, my country, and then those of others, that divide is not as solid as it appears. And that's exactly what this sutra is talking about. Okay, it's 8 o'clock here in Germany. No, it's 9 o'clock in Israel. I see it. Do we want to take some questions? Because I've talked for a lot and I feel like I've been talking to myself just because I'm missing a real life audience. So maybe I'll take some questions. If you have any questions so far about anything we talked about, anything else, please, you're welcome to ask.
If anyone has a question, maybe he can raise his hand in the mark. Okay, we have one.
Yes.
Yes, Daniel.
It's very nice to see you again. I've been through the Heart Sutra, and you've already provided a tremendous insight that I hadn't thought of. The only thing I'm struggling with is where in the structure of the Heart Sutra, and this is really a technical question, do you see the question and answer format? I think of it a little bit differently.
Okay. Can you hear me now? Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, question and answer, like I think I kind of said it in a way before, that this question and answer takes actually more place in other sutras where there's a lot more back and forth. Here's a question asked by Shariputra, and the answer is provided by Avalokiteshvara. So it's those two people. So question and answer, really just one person asks a question, the other one answers. So it's not a discussion as such. Maybe it took place. Maybe there was an actual discussion taking place, but it just wasn't noted. But in other sutras, there is more of a discussion style in the longer ones. Yeah.
Thank you.
That
answers, yes.
Okay.
That answers the question. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Sure. Another question?
Seems like no other questions. Okay, so if there is anything else, maybe we'll finish with the dedication.
We only have an hour?
I'm not sure.
It's an hour and a half.
An hour and a half. Yeah.
Leora?
Leora?
Yeah, an hour and a half. So if
Okay,
there are no
okay,
questions,
sorry.
then maybe we can continue.
Okay, I'll continue.
Okay, so
If there are no more questions, are there more questions?
don't see any more questions at the moment.
Okay, all right. Okay, so continuing with the Heart Sutra then. Well, if you have the text in front of you, does everyone have the text with them?
I will share it on the screen.
Can you show it on the screen?
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, there it goes. Oh, good. Yeah, good. All right. So here you can see from the amount, it's a extremely short sutra. Actually, there's sometimes something more at the beginning. There's like in Tibetan there's a line where it says, I bow down to the Arya 3 jewels. It starts off with this bowing, basically paying respect, which is not mentioned here, which is fine. Okay, so basically it's the sutra. It starts with the title. Starts with the title, Arya Bhagavati Prashna Paramita Siddhaya Sutra. Okay, so that's the Sanskrit title. It's the Sanskrit title. Here, all it gives is the Sanskrit title in the Tibetan translation. So as you probably know, but just for those who don't know, of course, this text that was translated here into English was translated from the Tibetan. And that, again, the Tibetan was translated from the Sanskrit. So most of the translations into Tibetan, so here we're talking about Buddhism in Tibet, or Tibetan Buddhism as it used to exist in Tibet, or even still now exists in Tibet. So this texts that they have, the scriptures they have around more than 300 volumes of texts that were translated from Sanskrit. Usually in the Tibetan canon, it's called the Tibetan Buddhist canon, they talk about the translated words of the Buddha himself and the translated words of the commentaries on what the Buddha had said. So there are over 100 volumes of translated texts from the Buddha himself, which is called the Gangyur in Tibetan, which just means a translation of the speech of the Buddha. And then you have more than 200 volumes called the Tengyur, or the translation of the commentaries or the treatises, which were commentaries, explanations given by later Indian Buddhist masters, as they're called. So those commentaries are really important because, as I said earlier on, when we just listen to the Heart Sutra, we read it or someone recites it and we listen to it, we won't understand that much because the style of speaking was so different. So it requires explanation. And many of the great masters who came after the Buddhists, according to the time, according to the needs of certain people, they explained in their commentaries, for instance, what the Heart Sutra was all about or what other teachings were all about. So therefore, you have this whole body of teachings that was translated into Tibetan from the Sanskrit language. There are also some teachings in the Tibetan tradition that come from Chinese, very few. They were translated from Sanskrit or Pali into Chinese, and then from Chinese into Tibetan. There's one sutra, it's called the Sutra Unraveling the Thought, which is also part of the third turning of the wheel, as I said in the very beginning. It's one of the sutras that is part of the third turning of the wheel. Well, that sutra was translated from Chinese. And then there are some Pali sutras that were translated, in particular when it comes to the teachings on the ethical conduct, on the Vinaya. Some of them were translated from the Pali, but the rest of it was from Sanskrit. And what was always very important was the title. The title at the beginning was always considered to be very important. Nowadays, giving a title to a text is so different. Nowadays, it's more catchy title or maybe something funny or what have you. But at the time when the Heart Sutra, for instance, was, well, put down into writing or was translated, it was always important to describe the content to the best ability, I mean, the best way possible, so that people got a sense what it's all about. So in this case here, it's the heart of the wisdom that has gone beyond ordinary understanding. That's basically the title here. That's given first in Sanskrit. Why was it given first in Sanskrit? So if you have the Tibetan text in front of you, you first have what is it called? Transliteration, like when you use the Tibetan to write Sanskrit. So you basically have those words, although it's written like we use now the transliteration of the Sanskrit, instead of writing with the actual Sanskrit alphabet. Here you have it in English, you have it in Tibetan as well. So first the Sanskrit title is given, and thereafter the Tibetan title. So the reason for that is to show that it's an authentic text that goes back to India, that this comes from India. This is not a Tibetan composition. It's not a Tibetan who composed this text. And so it says Bhagavati, here it says Arya Bhagavati. So Arya Bhagavati Prashnaparamita Hridaya Sutra. I'm sure my pronunciation is totally off. In Tibetan, and it says Chomdende Ma Shiragi Paratu Chimbe Do. That would be in Tibetan, and to be complete, you would have in English the essence of the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra. Okay. And then the actual sutra starts, and it starts already in a quite unusual way. It says, thus did I hear at one time, or thus have I once heard, different ways of saying that, which are basically the person who recorded this sutra. Again, quite important that, and here we're no longer talking about the translation. This is the actual text itself now. Now, with regard to the actual text, how did this come about? How can this be a teaching by the Buddha? Well, basically what happened was, after the Buddha passed away, a lot of the people around the Buddha had what is nowadays called photographic memory. It's a phenomenon we actually still find nowadays. There are very few people who have this ability to possibly recall a whole, I don't know, teaching or a whole lecture by someone. Well, this ability only very few people have, and usually they're born with that. But at the time of the Buddha, a lot of people had this ability simply because they had reached incredible degrees of concentration. And we all know the more concentrated we are, the better we remember. So mindfulness goes along with a strong degree of attentiveness and concentration. Concentration, mindfulness, attentiveness. So with regard to the more concentrated we are, the better we remember. And many of the great masters at the time of the Buddha had this ability to concentrate on one topic for 4 hours and so forth. They had certain states of mind, that developed states of mind, they're called calm abiding, where they were able, with which they were able to focus on one object for 4 hours at a time. And that degree of concentration allowed them to actually remember a whole lecture. And this was what happened here in this case, that one of the close disciples, in fact, he was a nephew of the Buddha, was called Ananda. He was always around the Buddha. He had actually asked the Buddha, please allow me to be around you so I can later on, I can be there when you give a teaching, and I can later pass it on to others. And so he had a permission to always be present. He was always there. And when after the passing away, the teachings of the Buddha were written down, he was one of the disciples who then sat down and recited everything he could remember, and that was written down. Now we don't know whether they remembered everything, but basically, thus did I hear at one time. He's saying, okay, so this is what I once heard. And this is what the sutra, what it starts with. So even that is said to be part of the sutra, although it's not actually, strictly speaking, by the Buddha himself. And then it goes on to describe, and here it's well, usually when you have a sutra like that, you can divide it up. So I gave you, or I sent you another handout. It's this chart. It's called HS Chart Text Structure, Emily Shu. And there you see the sutra is actually divided in certain parts. It says prologue. It says the beginning. Wait, let me check again. Yeah, HS and then underline chart, underline text structure. Can you see it here? This is what it looks like in my. Can you see? Oh, oops. Wait. Yes, that's it. Mm-hmm. All right, that's it. So you see that in the actual text has here been divided into different parts. So thus did I hear at one time, it starts with something called a prologue, a common prologue and an uncommon prologue. So just to say again what I said previously. So first, you have the meaning of the title. Then usually you have an homage, which it's here. It's not part of the text that was earlier shown. It's usually omitted. It's usually not in the Western versions. But strictly speaking, you would have, the translators would say, I pay homage, or I bow to, I don't know, the three jewels, or I bow down to someone. So this is actually from the translators. The translators give the title first in Sanskrit, the Tibetan translators who translated the text from Sanskrit into Tibetan. Then there is an homage by so first they give the title, then there's an homage, kind of paying homage to some entity, bowing or just expressing their respect, basically. And then the explanation of the main sutra starts. So here you have, of course, the title, then the explanation of the actual sutra, and it starts off with a prologue, with an introductory part. And it's called the Common Prologue because what it describes is the circumstances. What was the setting? What was the setting? Which I find that quite beautiful, because usually when we hear in a different kind of context, in terms of different topics, we hear a teaching, it's not necessarily clear what were the circumstances. But here you can actually imagine, you can really visualize you're in that place, because it describes the Bhagavan, the Buddha. Bhagavan is just an honorific term for the Buddha. Bhagavan here in Tibetan, for instance, the word Bhagavan, it means the one who eliminated that which is to be eliminated and has all the qualities that are to be gained. Chomdende, and who is the one who's gone beyond the ordinary. That's the meaning of the Tibetan word Bhagavan or Chomdende. So the Buddha, in other words, he was dwelling in a certain place, Mass of Vultures Mountain, the name of a mountain, in Rajgriha, together with a great community of monks and great community of bodhisattvas. So it's talking about the time, okay, at one time. It doesn't actually tell you exactly the time, but from the other words, you can kind of know what time that was. It was like at a time when the Buddha was in this place, Mass of Vultures Mountain. So it gives you, by saying, because the Buddha traveled all over India, so he wasn't always in the same place, but there was a time when he was in this particular place. So it gives you that time and also, of course, the place itself. And it also shows you who was present, who was there at the time. So there was a great community of monks and nuns. Actually, the Tibetan word monks is a generic term, which can also mean nuns. I don't know, like in English, you would say there were a lot of teachers. Okay, so teacher is just a generic term. It includes men and women. So in the same way here, for instance, the Tibetan word, there is a special word for women that can be used. But if you just say Gendun, as the Tibetan word is Gendun, so in that case, it can also include nuns. So in some translations, it actually says a great community of monks and nuns, and then a great community of bodhisattvas, as in like implying that they were not necessarily monks or nuns. Of course, some of the monks and nuns could have been bodhisattvas, but there were definitely the Sangha, as it's like the ordained Sangha was present, but there were also a lot of bodhisattvas present. So I personally, when reciting this sutra, I think it's always beautiful to bring the mind into the setting, to visualize India at that time, to visualize the place, to visualize the Buddha being present, like a teaching the way we may now know it nowadays with, for instance, the Dalai Lama, if the Dalai Lama teaches. So having monks and nuns around, having great bodhisattvas around, great other beings around, just that sets already the mind kind of, yeah, putting yourself into that spot. And that is called the Common Prologue. Why? Because that's what we can all see. That's what everyone was able to see at the time. It was common knowledge, basically. You all just had to look around you. There was the Buddha, there were monks and nuns, and there were all these bodhisattvas. One thing also about Mass of Vultures Mountain. What is it called? Yeah, it actually says in Tibetan only Vulture Mountain, Mass of Vultures Mountain. It's just, actually in Tibetan just says Vulture Mountain. So Vulture Mountain, there are different interpretations for why this was called Vulture Mountain. Some people say that many of the bodhisattvas, they appeared in the form of vultures. But I don't know. Why else vultures? Why would they come as vultures? I personally find that a little difficult, that interpretation. Others say that this mountain looked like a vulture. Well, this I also find difficult. I don't remember it looking much like a vulture. But anyway, so a different interpretation. Maybe at the time it did look like a vulture. Maybe it was just the name. Maybe there just were a lot of vultures usually there. I have no idea. But there are different interpretations. But still, we can identify this particular mountain by way of this name. So Vultures Mountain in Rajgriha. So that's the Common Prologue. Common as in like, we could all see this. We could all know this basically. And the next part is called the Uncommon Prologue. Sorry, just check the time here. That's the Uncommon Prologue, where what happens now was not common to an ordinary person like myself. If I had been there at the time, I wouldn't have known this. So at that time, the Bhagavan, the Buddha, was also present. Sure, we know this, we know he's there, but he was absorbed in a particular concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Actually, the Tibetan is more profound illumination. Sammo Sammo means profound, then nawa, as in like the profound illumination. As in like illumination has the connotation of illuminating, as clarifying how phenomena really exist. So basically the Buddha was concentrated on all the different phenomena and their actual profound mode of existence, clarified how phenomena really existed. So in other words, the Buddha was absorbed in a concentrated state, a meditative state, basically focusing on how phenomena really exist, their actual mode of existence. And also at the same time, there was someone present called the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara. So here it's very great honorific is used. It was a Bodhisattva, it was a great being, a Bodhisattva, a Mahasattva, a great being. Bodhisattva in the sense, of course, someone aiming towards enlightenment, having entered what is called the Mahayana path, wishing to become enlightened for the welfare of all sentient beings. So being therefore motivated by great love and compassion, great being, an Arya, someone who has realized, has experienced, oops, my internet connection is unstable. People are getting down to watch TV. So right now, I think my connection, can you still hear me? Shir, can you still hear me? Okay. I just had that thing on my screen suddenly. Okay, so here Avalokiteshvara, so it basically tells us something about the Buddha, what he's doing, and it tells us something about what Avalokiteshvara was doing, but in particular who Avalokiteshvara was. He was a Bodhisattva, so he had entered the Mahayana path. He was a great being, Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, because he was an Arya. He was someone who had realized, who had experienced the ultimate nature of phenomena directly. So therefore, the Bodhisattva, Mahasattva, Arya. So it's basically just an honorific. What was he doing? He looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and basically concentrating on, so he was focusing on how phenomena really exist. So he was engaging in the practice of the profound perfection of wisdom. So how was he doing that? How was he practicing? He looked upon the practice of the profound. This is a really weird way of speaking. Like I said, we don't talk like that. Usually what we would say so far, we would say the Buddha was in a certain place. There was this audience. He was on Valcha Peaks Mountain. There were bodhisattvas and monks and nuns. The Buddha himself was absorbed in a concentration where he realized the emptiness of all phenomena. And at the same time, there was this great person called Avalokiteshvara. And he was reflecting upon how to meditate on wisdom here, on the Prajna Paramita, on this special wisdom, by way of, in particular, checking out mind and body and understanding that not only the self is empty of inherent existence, empty of solid and independent existence, no, also mind, body, everything that makes me a person lacks inherent existence. So this is what this is basically saying. Okay, so now we're almost done. So just in a few words to wrap up what we talked about today, because it was quite a lot. It would be great if people had more questions. Right now it's just the outer format. What is most important, of course, is to talk about emptiness itself, and I will speak a lot more about this. But just to say a few more words about what we spoke about so far. We spoke a lot about, well, I spoke a lot about the situation that we find ourselves right now, the situation we find ourselves in, which is extremely challenging. It's a really difficult time for a lot of people, different for different people, of course, very difficult, but where spiritual or psychological training, I should put it this way, Dharma training, so training our own mind to not just be focused on the external material development, image, etc., all that, but it's a great opportunity to turn inwards and to engage in what's called psychological hygiene. So not just washing our hands 20 minutes every day, but to also, not 20 minutes, no, 20 seconds every time we touch something, like the way it's recommended, but also to engage in what the Dalai Lama calls mental or spiritual hygiene, mental hygiene. So to reflect upon our own mind, to reflect upon our own thoughts, etc., to engage in hygiene with regard to our thoughts, but also to become aware of our own fear, if there is any fear, and as a countermeasure to that, to read, for instance, learn about, meditate upon what's called the Perfection of Wisdom Sutra, or the Heart Sutra, that we're learning here together, as a means to overcome fear, which, especially at this point in time, it can be such a huge obstacle. It doesn't serve much of a purpose, except that we may be careful, okay, not to infect ourselves. But other than that, it's important to develop inner strength rather than lots of fear. And this is one way to go about it, to get a better understanding of what is taught in this particular sutra. Yes. So in that sense, again, like I said, to develop better understanding of reality, but also to understand that the kind of wisdom we're talking about here is a wisdom that is conjoined, that is influenced by love and compassion for others. So again, such a great opportunity that at times when other people act in a way that's pretty crazy all around us, to generate understanding of other people, where they're coming from, that they're also motivated by fear of what's going to happen, how they can avoid this virus, their fear of their situation, their financial situation, their job situation, etc., that they're motivated by that. So it goes hand in hand with a better understanding, putting ourselves into another person's shoe, what they're going through, and then based on that, instead of generating attachment or generating anger and frustration and so forth, to generate love and compassion in our day-to-day interaction. So I think this is a really precious opportunity, although it's challenging, but difficult times are said to be the most beneficial when it comes to Dharma practice. And although we try to avoid them, we try to usually do everything to get out of it, but then in retrospect, we often find that the hardest times were the ones we learned the most. If we really took the opportunity, we were able to grow better, we got stronger, and so forth. And I'm always reminded of an interview that the Dalai Lama once gave, and he was asked to reflect back upon his life. It was an interview not so long ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, so it was already quite old. And he was asked what was the best time in his life. If he reflected upon his life, what were the best times? And he said the best times were the times when he had the greatest problems, when he faced the greatest problems and challenges, because those were the times where he learned more about his own weaknesses. He learned what he helped to improve. He became stronger and more courageous. So I always thought that was beautiful. And of course, my first reaction is, oh, I wish all this was over. But then again, of course, one day it will be over, because there is impermanence and the situation will, of course, change. And at some point, it'll all be behind us. But in the meantime, to really use it to apply the psychology that is offered, that the Buddha has offered us. And like I said, it's really just a system of psychology. No one needs to become a Buddhist, be a better Jew, a better Muslim, a better Christian, or a better atheist, whatever your religion is or your beliefs are. But to apply some of the psychology that is presented here, and especially now, these difficult times. Okay, now Sherry, you wanted to say something? You got some time left if you want to do that.
Yeah, I see we have one more question. Do you have time for a question? Yeah, from Daniel.
I'd like to refer to the beginning of the sutra, which, as you explained, of course, is far more verbose than certainly than the Chinese version.
Mm-hmm.
But when I read the Chinese version, the sense that I get, and I just wanted to check the sense with you, is that while Shariputra was practicing the Prajnaparamita, he looks at the five aggregates and he suddenly has this great revelation, and he realizes that they are empty. And then the sutra goes on to tell about all the other things, which, and then of course he says, emptiness is nothing but substance, and substance is nothing but emptiness. And he goes on to enumerate, so much that he enumerates in the sutra itself. But if you put this in context, the main thrust, the main thing which is new, is this concept of emptiness. So that seems to me, and maybe I'm wrong, the main thrust of the sutra. And perhaps when we next meet, or when you feel it's appropriate, you can tell us how in the sutra this all ties into compassion, because this is something that I have not seen in the sutra itself.
Okay, well, you're referring to the Chinese version, which is not as long. So the whole part that we're talking about, that we've talked about now, with the common, the uncommon prologue, and even the question is not mentioned. It goes right into Avalokiteshvara, talking about emptiness. And yes, absolutely, explicitly, the text only speaks about emptiness, but there's an implicit meaning. There's an implicit meaning. And if you look through some of the material, it talks about the stages that a person goes through. And those stages a person can only go through if they have compassion, bodhicitta, and so forth. But yes, it's only implicit. It's not explicit. So as I earlier mentioned, this way of teaching is very unusual, because usually another teaching, another text that we read, we only concern ourselves with the explicit. The implicit is not part of it, or it's a lot more obvious. But in here, there is an implicit meaning that has to be explained, because the words themselves don't seem to reflect that. Yes, and I will definitely talk more about it. I think we can just go as long as it takes. I mean, since you don't have to show up, it's pretty easy to just lock in or not. I'll just continue for as long as it takes, but I guess we have time. I guess this will probably go on a little longer, and so we have time to go into detailed interpretation of this sutra, and to go more into how this talks about compassion, etc.
Thank you.
Okay, I don't see any other questions at the moment, so maybe we'll go. Yes, any other questions? No? Okay.
Maybe just one more thing. So like I mentioned before, could you please let me know, would you like to start with prayers or something, or maybe even a meditation, or are you happy with just doing it like a lecture in the sense I start and right with the topic, and then would you end with the dedication or not? If you could just leave your thoughts behind, and or just let everyone know, or let Shir know, and then we can start next time doing it the way you suggest.
I will post my maybe my number here, so people can write me maybe their thoughts, or if they prefer, and then they can share it with you, and then.
Sure. Yeah, I see already some comments. Yeah, it would be great to start with meditation. Okay. Better with dedications and refuge. Sure. Yep. Absolutely. No, I agree. All right. Yes, we prefer prayers. Okay, good. Let's do that next time.
Yeah, maybe just regarding, there is a question regarding the materials, just technical. Everything will be posted in the Dharma Friends of Israel site. I sent here the link. So all the materials will be posted there this week.
Okay. So, well, since the request has been given to do some prayers, now we can at least finish this session with a dedication, to dedicate whatever positive potential we have accumulated here together, although not together in the same place, but together on Zoom. May all that benefit ourselves, of course, that one day may this become a cause for us to develop our mind and eventually be able to tap into our greatest potential by removing all our negativities, but may also become a cause for this virus to subside, and may the people who suffer so greatly right now in countries such as the US, Spain, Italy, and so forth, that these people will very soon recover from their terrible disease. And yes, may the suffering that is happening right now, all the fear and all that, may that slowly subside. So let's dedicate this from the depth of our hearts. May the precious Bodhi mind that has not arisen, may that arise and grow, and may that which has arisen increase forevermore. Okay. Shalom. Have a great week and see you next week. Bye-bye.
Just a few words. I just want to say that this activity, such as all the Dharma Friends visual activities, is set by Dana, by donation, the kindness of the heart. Whoever can and interested to contribute can also do it in the same page in the link that is sent here in the chat. This is a way for us to thank our beloved teacher. So thank you all.
Okay. Bye-bye. So what do I do now?
Shalom.
Shalom. Do I have to press anything?
No, it's okay.
I don't have to press it.